Good morning and welcome to this morning's discussion on Seinfeld. This is Psyfeld, and we will be discussing the contest. So I will open this up to our undergraduate interns as well from minute one. So general question, where would you like to start this morning? What did you see that interested you? And the reassurance again that there are no wrong answers. The early Friday morning silence. Pick a character.
I think the entire episode focuses on impulse control, with different characters having varying degrees of control, and obviously a motivation behind remaining controlled, which is the monetary prize in the long run.
Great. All right. So, and this, what you identified is a common presenting symptom to psychiatry ambulatory clinics. So whether it's self-report or whether it's being accompanied by someone else, maybe the parents, if it's a child adolescent, maybe even local police. But in either case, a psychiatric evaluation may be requested. In 2013, the DSM underwent a revision, that's the DSM-5. Interestingly, the chapter where a lot of these disorders are kind of warehoused changed its name, different title. I do want to go back to prior to 2013 because the former title was informative. And in switching from that, I think a lot of clinicians forget how to proceed when they identify clinically significant impulsivity or disorders of impulse control. The former name of the chapter, and the one that I think is important to remember, is impulse control disorders not elsewhere classified, or NEC. And the title itself reminds us that when somebody presents with a disorder or a deficit in impulse control, that we really have to think of attributing it to a larger illness before we actually call it an impulse control disorder. And even though the same holds true in 2022, and Robert Wood Johnson medical students will have no problem remembering that, the average clinician will have a difficult time sometimes because, or in large part influenced by that name change. So let's go back to the former title of this chapter, and let's remind ourselves that impulse control issues, deficits are ubiquitous. And we have to keep an open mind when we start to develop our differential diagnosis. That said, the first step in this whole process is unconditional positive regard. That is, when a patient comes in, when a person comes in with evidence of a deficit in impulse control, it's normal until it's proven otherwise. So we're not going to pathologize, and that includes fictional characters, George, etc., until there is evidence that suggests that there is something going on that is causing clinically significant distress or impairment. When that happens, a doctor is needed. So that said, from this general idea of deficits of impulse control, is there a particular character we would like to now focus on?
So I think starting with George, his mother basically told him he should go see a psychiatrist, and he didn't realize, it never clicked with him that what he did was perhaps inappropriate or not the right time or place or for that. And I think he responded with everyone does it, but there's a time and a place, maybe.
And so along those lines, if George had a stronger ego, if George's ego strength was optimal, AKA normal, what defense mechanism do you think he might have employed? Kind of going along the lines of what you and, quite frankly, Mrs. Costanza are suggesting.
Rationalization.
He does. He rationalizes, yes, in his current state. But let's reinvent George and let's give him ego strength. Let's make him or allow him to have, in a rewrite of this script, ego defense mechanisms that are adaptable. If that were the case, this idea of there being a proper time and place for anything gets to the hallmark of suppression. That is, George has this id impulse upon seeing that magazine, but then understands, this is the superego, that it's inappropriate. And someone with a strong ego with adaptable defense mechanisms may be able to employ suppression, that they can put this impulse to the side until a more appropriate time and place. That's suppression. We don't see that here. We see someone acting on his id, resulting in what a third person might deem impulsive behavior that does cause clinically significant distress to self, George, as well as others, his mother. So now this is repetitive, and if it's a pattern, this probably will come to the care of a psychiatrist. Any other than allowing us to talk about ego strength and perhaps examples of defense mechanisms, anything else with George that caught your eye? What's his reaction when he's talking to his friends after the event? Doesn't he tell them that, I mean, what prompts the contest? What words out of his mouth result in a conversation that immediately gets to a contest? Anybody remember? I'll never do that again. Might that statement represent George's subconscious, specifically another ego defense mechanism? Might be splitting. I mean, all or nothing. I mean, without a doubt, I'll never do that again. So what we have here is a character that fails to demonstrate suppression, but does actually demonstrate an alternative defense, perhaps splitting in his reaction, albeit after getting caught by his mother. The other thing I want to mention here too, if this actually rises to the level of a disorder, if George consented to treatment, psychotherapy would be the primary focus, and aversion therapy certainly could be discussed as an option. And the reason why I bring up aversion therapy is because that's exactly what happens to George. In the middle of the act, his mother walks in the room and catches him. That is a over-the-top, dramatic example of aversion therapy. Now, in a psychiatrist's office, we do not replicate that. However, through other techniques, maybe covert techniques where an individual, through guided imagery, that does actually occur, that is an option. Okay, so again, not in vivo, but otherwise guided imagery, aversion therapy. What happens to George in it is his mother's hospital room? Yes, you guys missed the scene? Anyone?
He's tempted while his mother is like berating him about his act. He's tempted by the nurse giving a bath on the other side of the curtain, which is just this huge paradox that he's not hearing what's it's just not clicking that what he's being berated about is exactly what he's perseverating on in the moment.
Yep. So if he had presented to clinical attention, and if you/we were the established psychiatrist, and then upon follow-up, we heard of this next event where he does what he does in his mother's hospital room with her in that hospital bed. Are there any questions that come to mind that you might ask him?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I mean, what is a reasonable question for a psychiatrist to ask, hypothetically, in a follow-up visit when we get new information that this patient that presented to us a month ago, a week ago, presented for the reasons that we already discussed. But now we have new information that since then, in the interim, he does what he does in that hospital. And he goes back there for that very reason again. One question or any information we would like from George to kind of tease this out, what might be going on? I think it would be a follow-up question to what our observation already is, although I don't want to put any words in anyone's mouth. Do you think he's attracted or sexually stimulated by what's going on in the hospital bed next to his mother? Yeah, and if he is, and if this pattern is repetitive, and if this pattern's repetitive nature results in clinically significant distress or impairment, might there be an illness that we need to discuss? This is voyeuristic disorder, which is interesting because one of his closer friends, Kramer, is struggling with the same condition, or at least is behaving in such a way that if it came to the attention of a psychiatrist, voyeuristic disorder would be in that differential as well. So we have two parallel stories here that both converge toward this paraphilia, the sexual deviancy. Anything else from George or Kramer? Any other characters caught your eye in this episode discussing the contest? What's going on with Jerry in this episode? Let's take the lead character. One of the scenes that I want to briefly discuss for Jerry is when he decides to watch cartoons, G-rated material, so that he could maybe avoid any impulsivity. In psychiatry, is there any parallel there? As I mentioned before, yes, there could be regression here, absolutely. And and I think there might be regression here from a couple of perspectives. One is from Jerry's perspective and what we believe Jerry may be experiencing, or the dynamic that explains what Jerry is experiencing. The other way regression could enter into the conversation is through Larry David. That is, in getting into the producer's mind, is there any symbolism here? And the fact that Larry David or whoever wrote the script shows cartoons might be their symbolism of regression. So either way, here we have yet another defense mechanism. The other thing that might be going on here is that Jerry is trying to replace the impulse and impulsive thoughts of the id with more G-rated material that is filtered through the superego, right, governed by the reality principle. And that process might be indicative of thought stopping. So I have a thought, I do not want to have this thought, and I stop the thought by redirecting my attention. Thought stopping. Thought stopping, unlike thought blocking, thought stopping is a maneuver. It's part of cognitive behavioral therapy. In this case, self-employed. We don't see Jerry in a psychiatrist's office or a psychologist's office, but instead, in his own apartment, he's employing thought stopping by watching cartoons. And you could see with his body language what he's going through to stop that thought, to come to conscious awareness, that impulse from his id. What happens to these characters when they lose the contest?
They seem relieved and they sleep better.
No. So they all suffer insomnia as a result of the contest, or as a result of what the contest is about. This is just another example of anxiety inducing what is probably going to come up, or maybe as a final diagnosis, as primary insomnia, right? So an individual comes in on your shelf exam. You need to know that the new terminology for insomnia is early, middle, and late. So difficulty falling asleep, early insomnia; difficulty staying asleep, middle insomnia; early morning awakenings, or waking up feeling that you have not had restorative sleep, late insomnia. One potential cause of early insomnia are the obsessive or intrusive thoughts that people may endure when their head hits the pillow at night. CBT would be the single best answer in terms of next best step. And another example of what one might learn through CBT for insomnia, specifically primary insomnia, is thought stopping. That is, whatever those intrusive thoughts are, when your head hits that pillow, you simply stop and redirect your attention. An easy example of this is counting sheep. You count sheep, it's nothing that the sheep have or endow that result in you feeling sleepy. It's you're avoiding the anxious stimuli in your mind that actually induces sleep when, in this case, thought stopping works, if and when. Right, so primary insomnia, thought stopping, counting sheep. Another example of how some aspects of CBT appear in Seinfeld's The Contest. Any other, well, I will briefly introduce this, but I will not get into a lot of detail. When someone presents, let's call him Jerry, to clinical attention with the chief complaint of difficulty falling asleep, and the clinician rules out that the behavior is not due to the direct and physiologic effects of a substance, it is not due to an underlying medical condition, and it is not due to a larger mental disorder, that is major depression, etc. But instead is a primary sleep disorder, or again, 2013, rephrasing this, is a sleep-wake disorder. Primary insomnia would be in the differential diagnosis. But in getting to that single best answer, the first step would be for the clinician to break things down into two components. That is, this chapter in the DSM, the sleep-wake disorders, is divided into A, parasomnias, and B, dysomnias. Any guess as to what the primary difference is between a para versus dysomnia? Parasomnias focus on abnormal behaviors at or around the time of sleep, para, around the time of sleep, where the dysomnias focus on some dysregulation of the sleep architecture, so the neurophysiology, right? The different stages of sleep. What are the different stages of sleep? And in every neuron, brain, and behavior sleep medicine lecture, we always start out with normal physiology. It really applies across the board, but including sleep medicine, normal physiology, and then the abnormal. So before we get to the dysomnias, we have to first understand what normal sleep architecture is. Anybody want to give this a stab? For the sleep episode, most of us will say it, a night's sleep, but respecting those that work during the night and sleep during the day. The sleep episode, 11 o'clock to 6 a.m. For the majority of time, rotates or alternates between two phases, REM and non-REM. Where I think the majority of shelf questions focus are on the non-REM aspects of sleep, specifically stages 1, 2, 3, and 4. For all intents and purposes, and I might be wrong, but for the vast majority of questions that focus on stage 3, those questions usually combine and or absorb stage 4 as well. So stages 3 and 4 are usually combined into a single stage. The majority of your sleep time in the first third of the night will be non-REM. The majority, the final third of the night will be REM. But you have these alternating episodes, REM and non-REM. For the board exam, for the shelf exam, stage 1 sleep. What is the pathognomonic finding? It's a clinical finding. Stage 1 sleep is light sleep. It's alpha/theta. Alpha is that last bit of wakefulness. Theta is your light sleep. So stage 1 is that transition from alpha to theta. The hypnotic jerk, right? So when we used to be in classrooms, this is when that student in front of you, your peer in front of you, almost falls off their seat, right? Hypnotic jerk, but is in that stage of sleep where they actually do catch themselves and they do not fall off the chair, right? Hypnotic jerk, theta activity. Stage 2 sleep. Stage 2 sleep is going to primarily focus away from the clinical vignette. So you're not going to get the clinical vignette that describes somebody with the hypnotic jerk in front of you. Instead, what little vignette there is, you're going to actually have an EEG reading that is going to result in the single best answer. And that's stage 2 sleep, because there are 2 pathognomonic EEG readings. Those are sleep spindles and K complexes. Right? Sleep spindles and K complexes. We will discuss them in more detail later on today. And certainly when we talk about sleep disorders later in your rotation. Stages 3 and 4 sleep, again, combined. They're combined because both are represented, both are demonstrative of slow wave sleep, otherwise delta sleep. This is the deepest stage of sleep. This is the restorative sleep. So that's delta wave, that's slow wave, and that defines both stages 3 and 4. Any questions about the quote, normal end quote, sleep architecture? Okay, from that ultra quick primer, and not today, but we can then begin to focus on the sleep disorders, both the parasomnias and dysomnias. Again, during these different phases, there's abnormal behaviors, parasomnias, and there's also dysynchrony, the dysomnia. All right, we're right up to the bottom of the hour. Any final observations from Seinfeld's The Contest? All right, then we'll leave it there. We will have table rounds starting in about 5 or 10 minutes. So everybody stay tuned. I'll be meeting with the different teams momentarily. Thank you, everybody.